to today's episode of Leading with Agility, I should say, from
Leading
all of us
with
here.
Agility, Arif, come on.
Yeah, from all of us here at Humble Associates. Joined as ever by my colleague and friend TK. Say hello to everyone, TK.
Hello, everyone. We're not joined by all of us at Humble Associates, but quite a majority of talent doing podcasts.
Exactly. So the two of us here with you with another episode, and we're excited to be back again in our podcast studio, virtual studio, I should say. But yes, how are you feeling, TK? What's been happening over the last however long since we last recorded?
Oh, well, we recorded like a week ago. Only positive things. You might have seen that obviously we've announced we're on a trade show, so you can come and meet us in person at the end of the month at the World of Learning. I got myself some new digital audio gear. Not the full thing, but hopefully you'll be able to hear the difference.
In the next episode, maybe, yes.
Well, in this one, to start with, yes.
Oh, it is. Oh, you've got it now. Okay. Well, let's let our our listeners determine whether TK's audio quality has vastly improved or not.
Quality and skills. Your quality will improve because you might not know that I'm the mastering mixer and producer of the show, at least from the technical point of view.
That is true. Anyway, thank you again for joining us for another episode. Today, I guess in the last couple of episodes so far, we've been discussing our ideas around agile leadership quite broadly and in terms of what we think it is, what it should be. And we've been talking about some of the kind of behaviors and attributes, haven't we, TK, that we think forms agile leadership.
Yes, we did. And we're working ourselves on what we can phrase as a best definition of agile leadership. So watch this space.
We are. Yes, we are. But in the midst of that, and as that's been going on, for those of you listening here in the UK, it probably wouldn't have escaped you that there's been quite a big story that has, I guess, appeared in the front of our news agendas over the last week or so. And that's this quite shocking story, I think, exacerbated by an ITV drama around the failure, I guess, or the scandal that more than 500 postmasters and postmistresses were wrongly prosecuted for fraud, I should say, all because of a faulty IT system. Yes, that's the Horizon IT scandal, which I'm sure many of our listeners, especially those in the UK, would have heard about.
Also known as a post office scandal. And they've been prosecuted for theft and fraud, and they've been convicted.
Yes, many postmasters, sadly, convicted.
Did time.
Did time wrongly. It's now coming to light.
Indeed, yes. Thankfully, that's
quite late, I should say. I mean, this is a long-running scandal. It started in the early 2000s, and it's still continuing for many victims till today because they haven't got their names back, and in many cases, no compensation still received. So quite a big story, and there's lots in here, and we can probably tackle it from many angles. But of course, our podcast is all about leadership, so we're going to look at it from a leadership perspective. TK, what do you think we'll cover in today's episode, or what sticks out for you when we kind of just introduce this whole story to our listeners?
Well, I think it's a huge failure of leadership and huge failure of corporate, and dare I even say legal culture.
Yes.
That leaders are responsible, both business leaders and political leaders or legal leaders, that is the case, are there to uphold and create. This is where leadership can go wrong.
So culture is a big word, and maybe we'll touch on it in today's episode. But let's get into it a bit more, I think, for our viewers especially, and start. Sorry, I keep saying our viewers. We're listening with this audio. Why am I keep talking about viewers? I'm sorry about that.
But you can also view us through the eyes of your imagination.
That is true. That is true. Yes, good point. But thank you. Let's get into a bit more. And I think I wanted to start with is, for those of you, maybe, I'm sure many of you listeners have already watched the ITV drama. It's been so popular. So, and if you haven't, you've read about it. It's been in the news and so on as well, and plenty of press articles. We won't go into a lot of that, but for me, I think one of the things that really stuck out, I should say, from a leadership point of view initially is just this whether it's Fujitsu or whether it's the post office themselves, there's this culture, or there was clearly, maybe there still is, this culture of obfuscation. So this is the idea of, hiding the truth or hiding what was really going on versus actually being openly transparent. And from a leadership point of view, what kind of culture that probably led to, what that created, whether you look at the post office and there's been, I think there's been, some of the reports have already talked about a toxic environment that fed from that obfuscation that started at the top. And then, and similarly, from a Fujitsu point of view as well, from the information that's now coming to light, and from the case that went to the High Court in 2019, there's a lot that has come out, a lot of information and data that to this point. So I don't know, TK, where do we start from with that? What causes this to happen? Or what was the purpose behind it, I suppose?
Well, there's a lot of systemic failure. It's interesting when I've heard that, the post office had some internal prosecutors.
Yes.
Essentially, there have been, prosecutors, judges, and victims in their own case. It's a very interesting situation that had caused all that. There's so much that went wrong here. But I think the main angle that we can explore is how... sometimes you can have a ruthless transformation.
Yes.
And when you have a situation where you're trying to save costs, you're trying to push the organization into, let's just say, a modern age for some people, you can end up in a situation that some people are not only left behind, but seriously hurt by your endeavors, especially if you have no regard for the well-being of some people, and you have little regard to how the British Post Office is being held in people's minds, hearts, and culture, what service they expected, and what public trust it held.
Yeah. It's a good point. I think, but I think there's some questions for me around. The examples that I was picking out was, let's just take Fujitsu, for example. Right from the beginning, when the system was put in place, this IT system known as Horizon, they knew about bugs, problems, errors right from the start, and it has come out. Yes. It's come out now that one of the whistleblowers involved, a previous engineer at Fujitsu, went to his bosses and said, "Look, this is a problem. We need to fix it, and I think we need to rewrite the whole system." And the bosses flat out refused, said no. There's something there which caused that leadership and the culture of that leadership, the culture that leadership created, to not listen or not want to involve themselves in actually what the problems were, to I guess hide it in a way. Is some of it down to, maybe, as you alluded to, is some of it down to other external factors like, money, or shall we say the financial health or performance of the organization? I don't think
it's an external factor, Arif. Money is quite intrinsic in any organization's working. One would say it's the blood and the nervous system of every organization, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's right. But go on, what you were going to add?
Well, if you're asking, I think this is the lack of ownership. So
yes.
in a large organization, when there's a lack of, when there's a culture of a lack of ownership, and you've got a failure on your hands, like in this case, the situation where the system was, the word ropey was used.
Yes, that was a word.
Someone had to step up and take ownership of this mess. But in an organization that size, like Fujitsu, I can only imagine that if you try to hide away from responsibility,
yes,
it's going to be diluted by the number of people. And, it's difficult for some people to put their hands up and say, okay, fine, it's a mess. I'll take ownership. I'll deal with it, right? Someone has to take the big decision, and no one wants to.
And I guess there's a lot that comes with that responsibility, and perhaps gives a clue as to why that was avoided. So once you then take that responsibility, then do you assume some accountability as well?
Well, obviously, the two are very... success has many fathers, but the failure is always an orphan.
Yeah, nice saying. But yeah, the two go hand in hand. Excuse me, quite often. So that means there is something there that leadership culture created. That meant taking ownership was not seen as something positive. Is that fair? Would you say?
Especially taking ownership of a failure, right? So you've got a failure on your hands, and someone needs to blow the whistle. And, if you, for instance, look at the Toyota way of work and the Andon Code, when there's a failure, they'll deal with it. Because they know that at the end, the whole process, company, reputation, everything will get hurt. There's no point sweeping it under the rug. And that's just it, right? I understand that it's sometimes difficult to be transparent. Not everyone is into radical candor and admitting everything, right?
Yes.
And it's the personal culture embedded in the organizational culture and embedded in a geographical or country culture, however you want to call it. All this can work against people taking ownership. In fact, there are some Nordic cultures that are more into taking ownership, but that's a separate thing, neither here or there.
I think we're touching again a little bit on the point about fear as well. We talked about it in our last episode, and the reason I mention this is some of the background context to this particular case is looking at Fujitsu at the time of them winning the contract and then building the system and starting to put it into place. They weren't in a very healthy financial situation, and this is the kind of the point I was wondering about. And so, why am I mentioning that? Is perhaps there's that fear element that, look, if I as a leader now take the responsibility of fixing this, that means that many people who have expectations of me and my team, of the work we're doing and the delivery we're involved in terms of getting this live and getting this out to our customer, the post office, their expectations might not be met. That may have a negative impact on me, not only on the business performance. So am I really interested in taking on that risk? I'm fearful of the repercussions. Why should I do that? I'd rather just, continue on the path we've set down as a business and not ruffle the feathers. I think there's something along those lines that clearly happened. That's my reading of the situation.
We're speculating quite a bit.
It's my reading.
On the other hand, what might have happened, and we don't know, because this is still in investigation.
Yes,
maybe, and it's a more difficult one. What if they were aware of this situation, but they chose financial security of the organization and the Fujitsu family, the employees of Fujitsu? What if they had to make a hard choice like this? I know it's easy to paint Fujitsu as a villain in this story, but we don't know. And, they're definitely acting like one, not being transparent, not coming out with, and it's interesting because obviously it's an Asian company, right? There were other Asian companies that, the head leadership had done the humble bow and had admitted to mistakes. They're keeping it secret, but we don't know. However, what might have happened is no one wanted to take the blame.
Yeah, that's probably, it could be. I mean, you say you don't know, but I think there has been enough that has come out that tells us that we do know some things, right? I mean, some of the things that we do know is, for example, in the 2019 trial that happened, they told their engineers to not reveal information about bugs and errors they knew about. So there was already something of a culture of, well, we hide things. We don't need to tell people, So, okay, let's
keep it all in the family.
Exactly. Let's keep it in the family, something like that. But I think this raises also we've talked about Fujitsu. Look at it from the post office perspective again, and this has already come out. This is out in the public domain. They had a huge program of work to become financially independent from the government by 2020. That was a goal that had been set as part of them splitting off from Royal Mail and becoming an independent business, so to speak. And so what has come out as a result of that is some of the leadership behaviors were, under no circumstances should anything stop or inhibit that goal from being achieved. And so they saw all of this that was happening, these prosecutions or these annoying postmasters saying that, it wasn't their fault, etc. They saw it as a problem to be kind of like put to the side rather than dealt with openness and transparency. That's how I have understood things. I don't know, TK, what do you think? Again, it goes back to that same point. There was something there around other goals, other objectives taking precedence over being open and being transparent.
Yeah, something always has to take precedence, I think, and I'm not excusing the post office by any means. It's just an interesting thing that, in terms of change leadership, I think being very headstrong and focused on an objective, like, one would say, being self-reliant and being able to support yourself as an organization and not costing the taxpayer any more money, seems to be rather well-defined and virtuous objective. The problem is when you're focused on it so much that everything else becomes a problem. In fact, this is a popular change strategy, to be that single-minded. The problem is when a transformation like this makes you lose your soul, makes you lose the thing that people associate with you, Postman Pat and so on. People all around the world have a certain image when they think about the British Post Office, Royal Mail and so on, right? Postmasters, and if you watch the ITV drama or the Panorama show, from BBC, you'll actually see these people and these small post offices, and it's just
they were part
really
of the community.
Touching.
They are.
And
exactly.
This is how it's supposed to be. It is very culturally ingrained in the fabric of these small communities and the country itself. And turning the post office into a ruthless corporation, aka Uber, it's not something that you lose your soul. Fine for Uber to be as aggressive as it is. This is who they are. It's okay. Well, whether you agree with it or not, you can either use their service or not. You still have a choice. But a transformation like this, leaving the little ones behind, leaving the actual postmasters and all this miscarriage of justice has been done. I think they've lost their soul. And it's interesting because of the ordained priestess that was like their CEO.
Paula Venables.
She even has she has given up her title even. Oh man, such a huge thing.
Yeah, she has. So that brings us to something else I want to talk about, which is, and you've touched on it already a bit, about this. There's a level of arrogance, I think, in how you can see. You've described it as a transformation. I would say it's more than that. It's also the leadership stance many leaders have taken throughout this whole saga. And a few examples for me are, like we said earlier, the bosses at Fujitsu not even interested in listening to their engineers about what the problems were. Other examples are, you mentioned Paula Venables, the former CEO. She stepped down. She handed back her CBE award the other week. But she actually and her team blocked and stopped independent investigators from accessing data and files that were needed to, exonerate essentially these postmasters. Exactly. So they deliberately did things like that. They even made denials in front of MPs at hearings, claiming that that everything was fine when they knew otherwise. And then on top of that, I think the other arrogance is the financial bonuses they've received. I mean, some of the posts, you're talking tens of millions, at the same time as all these private prosecutions going around and people's lives being ruined. So there is so much here around what you've talked about, turning it into this corporate beast, becoming very far away from the community aspect of their business. But so I've summarized all of that, but I think what I wanted to focus on is we've talked a lot, our podcast about agile leadership and what that means and what does that look like. And the thing I drew from this was what was missing to me. One of the things missing was collaborative decision-making. Do you want to talk to that, TK, or shall I add a few thoughts?
Well, add a few things. I have a different view. I think something else was missing. So let's start with you.
Well, is it gone? Yeah. So I put it down. Well, I think if you look at the arrogance point to me is they all felt they were right and they all felt they were doing the right thing, but none of them ever consulted anyone else in how they came to their decisions. Or if they did, they were doing it in a bubble where it was all everyone agrees with the same thing, and there's a lot of groupthink, and there's a lot of, yes, we shall do this because we think this is the right way without ever challenging ourselves. So if there was some actual real collaboration in how they came to their decisions, I think they would have involved people close to the problem. They would have involved people who were affected and maybe challenged themselves into what they were doing. That's how I saw it.
I think you're right, but I would put it differently. I think they lacked reflection.
Right.
They did things and they went into these things. Sometimes it's difficult to turn back because they weren't able to reflect. And I think we're talking nearly about the same thing because sometimes, when a thought bubble, it's everyone saying the same thing, is difficult to reflect. So maybe you need coaches, mentors, consultants, Humble.associates, contact page, yes. But essentially, an agile leader is a leader that can and will reflect quite frequently on what they're doing. This is the first attribute of the agile leader.
Definitely.
And I think this is something that's really important because it's not about the strength of your conviction. It's always being able to understand what you're doing. Like, I think you might know that, or in terms of our listeners, you might know that I'm publishing the daily show, Coach on the Rocks, on LinkedIn. And I've talked about being stubborn.
Yes.
And reflecting on something that, you, Arif, and our entire team was actually convincing me, say, TK, look at this is not the way to go. You're doing this animation and possibly you shouldn't. And I think the as I said, the main attribute of an agile leader is like, okay, well, I'm being stubborn. It's important to reflect on that.
But that requires, I think, a culture. It requires people around you who can then feel comfortable voicing that. Right? I think that was missing.
Or requires you, okay, fine.
It's both.
If you don't have that, get it from the outside.
Get it from the outside.
Talk to someone, mastermind groups, consultants, coaches, Humble associates, again, plugging us. But, get it. Know that you need to have it.
Yes, and I would just add, I think it's that, and also we talked at the start about culture. You mentioned culture, and that's part of the problem. The culture these leaders created meant that was missing. And so because it was missing, I think it's even harder for them to realize, we need to get that from wherever else.
We're speculating, but theoretically what could have happened is, one, the culture was subordinated to this transformation effort. So anything that was hindering the effort was taboo. Second of all, what might have happened is that the leadership culture might be that when the CEO says that it's not a problem, and no one else should say it is. So these two things might have happened. We don't know if they did, but frequently they do.
I guess, if Paula Reynolds is coming, for example, to a hearing with MPs and repeating that constantly that, everything's fine and then there is no problem, even though everyone knows there is a problem. A lot has been mentioned about a toxic and secretive management culture in the post office. That's been reported. So there's no smoke without fire. I know we're speculating, but there is something there already that's come out which suggests, I think what we're saying is quite likely the case. In terms of arrogance,
dare I say, I will say the following thing. Okay, so what I will say is, like, in terms of this hearing, I can bet, and I know you're not a betting man, that a certain Donald Trump thinks that he's the most intelligent person on earth, and all the elections that he lost, or contests he lost, were stolen from him. And I believe he's quite convicted. And if you were to depose him, and even under a lie detector, it would say that he's saying the truth because he clearly believes it.
And your point is,
I'm saying that because, it's arrogance on one thing, but groupthink and blindness in terms of nothing was wrong. I can't see anything wrong, especially in people in power. You can have that because leaders sometimes, senior leaders, feel like they know best because everyone expects them to know best.
And that's my point. Yeah. So I think we're saying the same things, just probably coming at it from a different point of view. So you're right. And the other last thing I think is the humility. I think this also is associated with all of what we're saying, which is, from a leadership point of view, demonstrating humility to that point about you not knowing best. Right? You can't be you who knows best. It's not possible. There are other people highly skilled, etc. You got to involve them in the process. I think that's a key thing as well.
It is quite
As a
true.
lesson.
Some would say that, if you're being too humble, people will not respect you.
I haven't met any of those people. Have you, TK?
Well, I've met people that would say that.
Okay.
I've met people that would say that they need to be or show up in a certain way, because
But I
only
think-
then will they get respect.
But we talked about this in our last episode, and I think
We
we
did,
did a
we
good
did,
job
yes.
of sharing how you can do it with those examples, how you can show that humility with those examples, without appearing to be weak or whatever you might think. But anyway,
Or even appearing to be weak. Not everyone's always strong, right?
Yes.
There's always an interesting dichotomy. There's always another side of the coin. Nothing's ever black and white, except in certain books.
so with that, let's move on a bit, and I want to now focus or switch attention to what type of leadership do we need, and perhaps a bit about what was really missing. Well, we've talked a lot about things that have been missing, but I think a bigger overarching theme of what was missing, and that to me is ethics in leadership, right? So the idea that we're doing things for the right reasons with the right values in mind because we want to behave in an ethical, morally sound manner, that I think appears to be missing in all of what we've been talking about, given all the evidence that's been coming out so far, throughout this whole scandal. And some reading I was doing describes this point in this way, which I thought was a nice way to share, a nice way to think about it. This concept of bounded ethicality, which is the idea that leaders face systemic cognitive barriers that prevent them from being as ethical, as they wish to be. What does that mean in plain, simple language? From what I'm reading and from what I've been looking at, it's all about whether it's external or internal to them. There are biases. There are things that they perceive to be true. Perhaps they believe to be their beliefs of their own that they have. All of these things come into play when it comes to making ethical decisions. TK, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, as always, I'm quite philosophical, and there's always different kinds of ethics. I think our research, which we did before recording the podcast, I think there was some talk about AI, and there was some talk about self-driving cars. It's an interesting one, and for instance, there's the famous trolley experiment. Are you aware of that, Arif?
Maybe our listeners aren't. I'm not aware.
There's like a train that's going to run over a few people, and
you got to switch.
Yes. You can switch the track, and many people prefer not to switch the track because they don't feel responsible, even though more people would die.
Exactly.
There's variations of this particular thing. I'm just saying that in this case, there's an interesting dilemma, because you have a situation where, as the famous British saying, doing the right thing. And what's the right thing to do? And I think this is a great cultural asset of, Britishness, that people are reflecting on this question. Not many cultures do. That's one thing. Second thing is, like, if you look at, for instance, Fujitsu employees, or if you look at the leadership of the post office, is the right thing to protect the Fujitsu family with, so they don't suffer more in terms of financial hardship and reputational damage, or is the right thing to actually come out and help the little ones, the postmasters, right? Own the failure. With the post office, the same. Is the right thing to plow on with getting the business floating on its own, or is the right thing like turning the business into a very caring institution that obviously would have to be sponsored by the taxpayer, because it's not easy to get to be profitable without maybe some dose of ruthlessness, some would say, right? Mm-hmm. So there's always a spectrum, and this ethics and this trolley dilemma is something that a leader has to constantly strive with. And I think asking the British question, which is what is the right thing to do? So again, the quality of reflection, even outside reflection, and basing your ethics in some grounded concept. It's interesting because she's a priest, is helpful. isn't it? Right. So you get it from somewhere.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that example of the choice, how many people to save, right? That's what that example talks about. And some of the research on this shows that, if you put this in frame that in a different way, say you got asked, how much would you pay to save 2,000 birds from drowning in oil, in a pond?
Daniel Kahneman.
Yeah, Daniel Kahneman's question, right? And he's a famous psychologist, and he's got that. His well-known book is Thinking Fast and Slow. So if you're interested in reading more about Daniel Kahneman, have a look at his book Thinking Fast and Slow.
Great book, nevertheless. Yeah.
But yeah, his quandary that he proposes to his colleagues is. Two questions. So, how much? If I ask you, how much would you pay to save 2,000 migrating birds from drowning in uncovered oil ponds? And the second question, how much would you pay to save 200,000 migrating birds? So, his research has found that people who are asked the first question offer about the same amount as do people who are asked the second question. So, this is quite interesting, and it illustrates, I think, in his view, the limitations of our ethical thinking. Suggests that improving ethical decision making requires deliberate decision making. So you've got to be very deliberate and far more conscious.
Reflection.
Yes,
right?
it goes to
making
reflection.
Sure you reflect on your decisions.
Yes.
Because this is interesting about Kahneman, because these answers are instinctual.
Yes.
He obviously has done the research.
Yes.
So you've got this thinking fast, thinking slow, and the thinking fast brain.
Correct.
Or brain 1, I think. I can't remember the exact numbers, to be honest.
He calls it System 1 and System 2.
System 1.
Yes.
System 1 will give you the answer that might not always be the right one.
Right.
But if you reflect, if you spend some deliberate time making a decision, you will engage System 2 that will help you make the right decision. And sometimes you might even be more confused and become a TK-type philosopher of everything's relative. But then again, it's fun. Let me know. We can have a chat.
Exactly. And so and his point has been that the system the System 2 type thinking, which is where you're more deliberative, as they call it, as opposed to intuitive, as you were saying, leads to more ethical behaviors. So that's a critical thing. And so I think let's just touch on some practicalities for our listeners, right? How do you, as a leader, or how do leaders embody this more? How do we increase our ability to make these type of ethical decisions? We've talked about reflection. Maybe we need to talk about some reflective strategies in another episode. That could be something we can do. But
especially since we believe it's such a high priority for agile leaders.
Exactly. And so there's two things that Daniel talks about. Or actually, there's another philosopher called Joshua Green in the reading I was doing that is referenced here, and he talks about two examples. One is to make more of your decisions by comparing options rather than assessing each individually. That's one way of comparative. Do a lot of comparative. So when evaluating one option, so when we evaluate multiple options, our decisions are more carefully considered and less biased, and they create more value. That's the thinking behind that approach. Have you got examples of that, TK? We can share with our listeners, maybe, where we've done that, where you felt
calling me to the blackboard trying to give examples. I think no, I don't, off the top of my head, to be honest, and I'll be transparent about it. But excellent. I think one thing that it's important, as always, to be on a bit of a counter is watch out for the analysis paralysis, right? Because
of
sometimes
course, there is that. But I think a good example that our listeners would definitely relate to, here's one I'll give you, is evaluating job offers, right? So you're going through that career. You're in that phase in your career where maybe you're looking at moving on. You apply to a number of roles, and say for instance you get 2 offers back. It's very different. I think it's rare. I've not really come across anyone who makes an intuitive decision where they say, okay, yeah, I know that offers, I'm going with this one. Without thinking too much, I'm going straight with option 1. That's the one for me. Most people, I think you'd agree, TK, would be very deliberate in how they make the choice.
Yes, most people. I'll give you the most people. Although I've seen people that just follow their gut or the sign
True.
from the heavens, or their zodiac sign. But the thing, okay, so I'll give you a different example. It's very interesting because if you get into, and again, maybe it's a bit of a callback to when we started the episode, audio protection, you will see that all the filters of the plugins have an A/B setting, and it's designed for you to set it at one point as A, then set it as B, and constantly compare which one you like better. And it's incredibly subjective, and you're supposed to cleanse your palate in terms of your ears and constantly make a choice and compare two options together so you know
Two options, yes.
where you go with your mix, right?
And that's the key
how
bit
you set your compressors and such, yeah.
It's the key thing there you've highlighted, which is comparing two options at the same time. And that's what the research finds, is that when you compare two options at the same time, you get more ethical results, essentially. Now, moving on, the other strategy that the philosophers talk about, and this one is something the philosopher John Rawls mentions. He calls it the veil of ignorance. This is quite a fascinating one as well, which is basically to assume you know nothing when you're making that decision. So put yourself in that blank slate mode before deciding. I don't know. Have you ever, thought about? Have you heard of this one, TK? Have you come across this? Is it something?
I'm definitely quite impressed how philosophical our episode is becoming. So that's one thing.
Yes.
Second of all, beginner's mind. I've never heard about this particular philosopher, and kudos on doing so much reading for the episode. But as always, a point to contrary is that it can be hard because sometimes what we might get is we might feel an emotion when it comes to a particular decision. It's interesting because this is system 2 being more conscious, and system 1 possibly dealing with emotions a bit more. So when you get a gut feel, you might approach it with beginner's mind as you know nothing, but you can't make yourself feel nothing. I mean, if you're a Shaolin monk in his 80s, and Buddha and whatnot, I'm sure you can, but the majority of us, as you say, Arif, will struggle. But
they do, and then the reading I was doing, that is a valid point, and it's set out at the beginning, which is, look, no one is saying you're suddenly going to become this ethical person, you always make the right decisions. No, but these are the strategies I think we can all learn from to help us at least improve our ability to make the right decisions. So I like that. I think that's more achievable.
Continuous improvement, another big pillar of agile leadership, isn't it?
It just connects to what we've been talking about, the reflectiveness, everything connects, the humility aspect, the constant improvement. One quote that stood out for me when I was reading was this one, and I think it's something to maybe end on, or maybe for us to ponder over, all of us, including our listeners, which is this: executives unconsciously overlook wrongdoing if it benefits them or the company. And I think in some ways that really captures a lot of what we've been talking about, whether we look at Fujitsu, whether we look at the post office. It's a shame, it's sad, but I think it speaks to a lot of what we've covered today. What do you think, TK?
Difficult one. If something's unconscious, you can't be blamed or you can't be guilty. But a reflective leader brings the unconscious to the level of consciousness.
Yeah. And so with that, I think, as I said, there's a lot for us to think about and ponder as we kind of close out today's episode. It's been a difficult...
Reflect on it.
Reflect on. Sorry. We should get into the language. I apologise to our listeners. Reflect. There's a lot, yes. And it's a difficult topic to cover. I think I want to, just acknowledge that. This is a ongoing scandal affecting so many people's lives. It's been tough to follow it. And if you're interested in reading more or watching more, TK, I think we've got some resources, haven't we? So on BBC iPlayer, you can watch a panorama documentary called The Post Office Scandal. What else is there? On ITV, what have we got on ITV?
Okay, BBC iPlayer is available to the people being blessed in the UK or blessed with the ability to use the VPN, but they should pay the TV license for a wonderful national treasure, which is the BBC. I'm sure you can find something on YouTube, or maybe we'll link something in the episode description.
I might link
it's
some
available
stuff
to people all around the world.
Yes, there's also the ITV drama that went out that publicized this and brought it to a wider attention, and there's a lot of reading material as well. So we may put some of those resources in the episode description for you to look into. But yeah, thank you for being a part of today's session. And I think just kind of to draw things to a close, as we've continue discussing this topic of agile leadership, I think there's much to be said about some of those things that we've mentioned, the reflection, the need for reflection as leaders, the humility, how we make decisions, how we involve the right people in making decisions, and some of this around ethical behaviors as well. What highlights do you want to share with our listeners from today's episode, TK?
Everything's relative. Not make assumptions and keep yourself educated. And I think as you'll watch these shows and programs, you will know that there's a strength in finding people with similar problems. That's another aspect of leadership which we haven't talked about, but these people fought back and they've succeeded.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, with that, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you on our next episode. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.